We are good to go. Welcome everyone for our last show. Well, not last show, but we don't have another one currently scheduled. But today we will be breaking down the official NCAA women's basketball Division III tournament bracket. Riley, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Scott. A lot of anticipation, obviously, heading to the bracket. A little different than past years, being that we knew everyone that was in the field, but still some interesting things that came up over the course of the bracket reveal that will give us plenty to talk about here. So excited for this tournament ahead.
Most definitely. So we're going to jump right into the bracket. We might go fairly quick through the individual matchups, as this is not intended to break down the individual games that will be happening. But just as we start out here in the top left, if you have any thoughts about either the host, the pod, or the individual matchups, just jump right on in.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. Like I think, we kind of expected obviously the hosts here are a big surprise, right? We knew Bowden Smith both in line to host. I was surprised. I'll say this, Vassar, I kind of expected them to head down towards a Catholic type pod rather than being sent up towards Smith. So I was surprised to see on the bracket. It kind of, it makes sense. The seating isn't off there or anything like that. Amherst in there with Smith is kind of interesting as well to see. I think it's just an interesting pod, but I think the seating as a whole in both the Bowden and Smith pods makes a lot of sense for the most part.
Yeah, Bowden, Brooklyn, Cortland, Endicott matches up perfectly with a 116, 8, 9 seeding. Amherst was one of the largest miss seeds. They are about an 8 true quad seed, and I believe they are seated here like a 5. And Smith was about a 3, and they're seated here at about a 4. I think the reason Vassar went north is they have actually played Catholic and Johns Hopkins this year, in addition to
I
Mount
forgot.
St. Mary and Trinity, Connecticut. So all 4 of those would be non-conference rematches that are allowed but try to be avoided. But I agree, it was really good seating here right off the bat. And then we get to Texas, which is our 2 other largest miss seeds of Texas Lutheran and McMurray, but we kind of expected that. I know that there was chatter about this matchup here, ETBU versus Texas Lutheran, is to avoid the McMurray East Texas Baptist rematch?
Right. They already played back in December. So
And I think this gives everyone a really good picture of there are 2 things the committee is trying to optimize. Which one do they pick? Do we avoid a non-conference first round rematch, or do we stay truer to seeding? And at least in this spot, they decided to avoid the first round non-conference rematch.
yeah, and I think go ahead.
Go ahead. I think this was pretty much what we were expecting, was going to be
Right.
ETBU hosting 2 SCAC teams and then a fly-in for the 4th.
Yeah, that's all I was gonna say as well. I don't think there was a lot of surprise here. I mean, and at that point, like obviously, again, I mean, you said there was some chatter about TLU playing ETBU in that first round, but at the end of the day, I think it really kind of makes sense. I don't think there's anything too crazy here. And again, the Texas pod always tends to have a little bit of this dynamic, being a little different than most of the other pods that we see on the bracket, just because of geography and some of the aspects of that.
Moving down to the Gustavus pod, Gustavus is facing Wisconsin Lutheran. Wisconsin Lutheran, we knew that teams were going to get underseeded. Is that the word? Because Wisconsin Lutheran is about a 13 seed in the field at large, but they're seeded here like a 15 seed against the 2 seed Gustavus. There just aren't a lot of true 16, 15, 14 seeds in the upper Midwest this year. And then Warburg and Stevens Point were both a little bit off their true seeds of 5 and 11 in this 7 and 10 matchup. But I think kind of the gap between them makes a lot of sense with where they are seated. So I think, this is a really, really good pod. Nice that they were able to, or decided to put Wisconsin Lutheran up against Gustavus and not the UMAC champion, which I don't know if that was on our show or not, but someone commented that would be pretty boring. I think it was either Megan or Justin, that it would be boring to send the UMAC team to Gustavus, and they indeed did not do that.
Yeah, I thought, yeah, that would have been superior. And yeah, I thought, I mean, it creates a little bit more of an interesting matchup. I think Wisconsin Lutheran definitely one of those teams that, we could see. I think you make a great point too. Just the Midwest, if you look at it as a whole, a lot of teams in a range where they're not going to hit those really high seeds. So you got to push some teams a little bit further up. Like in Wisconsin Lutheran, there would normally be a 13 to a 15, just because you don't have a lot of those teams. There's not honestly, really many one bid leagues in the Midwest. So you have a lot of these multi bid leagues, and as a result, those teams are going to be a little bit, of the teams that would be grouped higher seeded wise. But you got to create something because again of the geography involved in this, and I thought they did a good job with that here.
Moving on to, this would be the bottom left quadrant. Illinois Wesleyan is the 2 seed in this quadrant, facing center in the first round. That's a perfectly seeded matchup. And then Trine, Transylvania, their true seeds are about a 6-11, 6 and 11, and this is in the 7-10 matchup. So maybe a little bit tougher draw for both Trine and Illinois Wesleyan looking ahead to a potential second round matchup. But the Midwest, again, just did not have a very even distribution of seeds throughout. It's not like you could just pick a perfect 7 seed to put them in here with the Illinois Wesleyan pod, and the difference is only 1 seed line off. But this looks like a pretty packed pod. I know Transylvania is a different team than they were last year, but this is still a pretty packed pod.
Yeah, I think this could be one of the better pods, honestly. It's just a lot of teams in here that all 4, very, very strong. I think, Illinois Wesleyan Trine second round matchup could be really interesting. I know I've been higher on Trine from a top 25 ballot perspective than a lot of people, but I just think Trine is a very, very good team. We may not, not have seen it this past weekend at the MIAA tournament, but I think that could be a really interesting second round matchup, one that maybe we would be more likely to get in a later round if you were able to, make it specifically exact, seeding wise, like a full 1 through 64 seeded tournament. So that could be a really interesting pod out of that work.
Now we're headed to the Oshkosh pod. They face Calvin, who is appropriately seeded as a 14 seed, but is kind of one of those teams that gets picked to be the upset in the Division I tournament. Right. You're surging 14 seed that won their conference tournament. And so while that's appropriately seeded, it might be a tough draw for Oshkosh. And then Bethel and DePauw in your kind of that is the 6-11 matchup, and I have them as 5 and 12 seeds. So really, really close to their true seeds. But DePauw also is a team that I think is a pretty tough draw. I think they out-rebounded Wittenberg by 32 in the conference title game. And so, yeah, these are just 4 solid teams that I'm not sure how much any of them are going to beat themselves, and will be tough outs.
Yeah, I think just really quickly, I mean, if you're looking for some upset picks, like this could be right where it's at. I mean, because DePauw was a team, like if you think back to the preseason, a team that a lot of voters were really, really high on. They have the personnel there to be very good and to win a couple of games in the tournament. It seems like as of late and as, kind of the second half of conference play, and obviously in the conference tournament, we saw more of that DePauw team that we were expecting to see all year. And similarly with Calvin, play a really strong schedule. They've been tested a lot. Won 2 really, really big games back to back over Hope and Trine. So yeah, some upset picks here perhaps. We'll see how that Midwest pod plays out in Oshkosh.
Ohio Wesleyan hosting Immaculata, 4-13 matchup, and they are 4 and 13 seeds, really good seeding there. And Messiah and Washington and Jefferson. Washington and Jefferson is a true 10 seed, but they are kind of playing like the 12 seed here. So tougher matchup for Messiah. But just just as we're seeing everywhere, we knew that seeds were not going to be exact, and they are very, very close throughout the whole bracket.
Yep, exactly. And I think, I mean, that's again, like I think it makes a lot of sense here. Again, seating wise, uh, kind of, I think it's a nice solid pod. Everyone really pretty closely, located to each other. Fairly predictable, but I think it just makes a lot of sense. Again, we talked about this with the MPI and being able to actually see real seating, how that might change what the committee was able to do in terms of creating unique matchups. I still think they did a pretty good job. This pod is an example of that, keeping everyone relatively seated the right way, and we still get some unique matchups here against some really good teams. I mean, Messiah, W, and J could be a really solid first round matchup there.
And then down in the bottom left here, 1 seed Baldwin Wallace hosting LaRoche with Washington and Lee and Merchant Marine also in the pod. That Washington and Lee Merchant Marine matchup is really intriguing to me. And Baldwin Wallace and LaRoche is our lone non-conference rematch in the first round. But if you take a look at who can bust to Baldwin Wallace, a lot of these teams were sent east to face higher seeds, right? So these 3 here are off the board. They went to face Bowdoin, NYU, and Scranton. And then you're already down into this kind of range here where I think there was some geographic implications. I bet you LaRoche can't get to Illinois Wesleyan. And so that's how you end up with a non-conference rematch like that. There's just not this obvious, let's swap these 2 teams.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's not always that easy. And yeah, you're right. LaRoche, 540 miles to Illinois Wesleyan, so that would not have worked. Yeah, I think I mean, again, kind of interesting the way that they were able to put this together. Getting Merchant Marine to play WNL. I always say, past couple of years, especially these pods in Ohio, and sometimes we've had more than we have this year, but like hosted out Baldwin Wallace, it creates some unique matchups because of where you can get teams from and to, both, up and down the East Coast, and sometimes, as you said, from kind of the Midwest area. So interesting, always an interesting pod at Baldwin Wallace, and certainly will be again this year. That WNL Merchant Marine matchup will be one to circle for the first round for sure.
Moving over to the top right, NYU, our overall number 2 seed, but a 1 seed in this quadrant, gets Gallaudet in the first round, and UMass Dartmouth plays Trinity, Connecticut. This is almost a perfectly seeded pod. Mass Dartmouth was a true seed, 7 seeded as an 8 here, but the other 3 are spot on. I don't have any other comments on that pod.
Nope, I think yeah, NYU hosting. I mean, as expected. Again, I think the seeding makes quite a bit of sense there.
Down in this matchup, I believe Christopher Newport is seated as the 5, Montclair State is the 12, Catholic as the 4, Geneseo as the 13, which means they're all perfectly seated.
Yep.
Perfectly seated. And in my head, it feels boring to have Catholic and Christopher Newport in the same pod, but I don't think that they were in the same pod last year, and they did not play this year. And so maybe it isn't very boring. I think there just are fewer elite teams in that specific geography, so it feels like they get put together rather than moving apart. But they have not played very recently. So Montclair State won the NJAC, and Geneseo won the Empire 8.
Yes, yeah, they beat Brockport, and kind of a bid thief situation there. So yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. Again, you talked about, I mean, perfectly seeded. Yeah, CNU Catholic. I mean, sometimes you see these matchups and you think, teams are located so close together that they must have played pretty recently. And then you start to look back at the history, and it's been a little while. And so, if you can get back, to where it's a more unique matchup, at least for the players on the floor, even if they played 6, 7 years ago, and I have to double check it, if CNU and Catholic have played more recently than that. But if it's the first match between the two for most players on both sides, I think it still creates kind of an NCAA tournament feel, getting a new opponent up against you. So we'll see. I mean, that would be a great second round matchup, assuming both get through.
Randolph-Macon. So we didn't have any large hosting surprises from the men's bracket reveal earlier, as we saw NYU, Illinois Wesleyan, and Randolph-Macon men not hosting, which was the indication that the women were hosting as expected, along with the Christopher Newport men hosting, which meant that the women were not hosting also, which was expected. Right. But here we are at Randolph-Macon. I believe Randolph-Macon was the only spot that Piedmont could go, and so they're about a 15 seed playing as a 14 here, really close seeding. And then Elizabethtown at Brockport State is your 6-11 matchup. And that's another cool matchup of cross-region teams that we rarely see during the regular season and is part of the excitement of the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, it kind of made sense for E-Town to go to Randolph-Macon. I know once they lost in the landmark semifinals, I got a couple of questions about that. And it seemed like Randolph-Macon was kind of going to make sense to send E-Town there. To get Brockport there, I think is really cool. I didn't know where Brockport end up. Randolph-Macon's honestly a little further south than I thought we might see Brockport end up being sent. So again, you get some of those more unique teams, on the road, traveling, creates some cool matchups. So yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense, even though, the committee was already a little bit restricted. As you said, Piedmont had to go to Randolph-Macon. We knew that was a done deal. So I think they did a good job getting the other two there to make it a little bit more of an interesting pod.
It is 481 miles from Brockport to Randolph-Macon. So they used that 500-mile limit well. And then in the last pod in the top right quadrant, hosted at Gettysburg, they face off against Stevens that is the 2-15 matchup. And then let me just make sure. And then in the 7-10, Western New England and Tufts. And those are 4 perfectly seeded teams. Cool to see. I like that Western New England Tufts matchup. A lot of the NESCAC teams were right around that 8, 9, 10 seed range. And so they were not going to be faced up against each other. And so we get a NESCAC Tufts against Western New England in this pod.
Yeah, I really like that matchup a lot. I think it'll be interesting. Tufts has played and beaten some really good teams this year. And yet, at 15-10, I think we've seen some inconsistency from them at points, right? Even through NESCAC play. But when we've seen them play really well, I mean, they were good enough to go and beat Smith not all that long ago. And then Western New England has been an interesting team all year. Didn't play the strongest schedule. And yet I think, they're capable of really contending with Tufts and pulling out a first round win here. So that's going to be a real 50-50 on a neutral court matchup. And really both teams kind of far from home there too. So they'll be on the road a little bit down there to Gettysburg.
On to our last quadrant, bottom right quadrant, and we get our most interesting pod, I believe, of the bracket. We have quadrant 2 seed Whitman against quad 15 seeds UW Superior. And this will be at Wisconsin Stout, who face off against Ripon. This is not a perfectly seeded pod, but it's really, really close. No one is more than one quadrant seed off. But the surprise here is high-ranked Whitman. I believe they were the 5th overall team, is not hosting a pod. And it sounds like the reasoning here is twofold. This first part, I think, is conjecture on our part. But this saves a flight during the opening rounds of the NCAA tournament. And if you look around the entire bracket, the 16 pods are a little more spread out geographically. And it could be the committee is choosing to potentially spend some of their flights allotment. As squishy as that allotment is in the sectional round, rather than, say, putting the Whitewater pod, the Gustavus pod, the Wesleyan pod, the Oshkosh pod, they can't put all 4 together because I think multiple teams are in the top 8. But they could just smash a bunch of those together and say, hey, no one's going to have to fly second weekend. Right. And those are a little more spread out. And it could be that was at Whitman's expense. And then
Yeah.
there was another question about why is this at Stout when there are higher ranked teams in this geography, this area, that are not hosting, specifically Bethel. And a big reason for that could be if you're kind of, you're already giving Whitman a raw deal, but not having them host, you don't want to send them to a really strong
Right.
second team in the pod. And Stout is a lower seed than Bethel. So in a weird way, you could say that Stout being lower than Bethel is why they got the host. Which again, the committee is balancing multiple priorities here.
Right.
So last year, when NYU could not host in the opening round, and I believe Washington and Lee could not host in the opening round, or was it Catholic that couldn't host in the opening round?
I think it was Catholic.
The hosts for the opening weekend ended up being DeSales and Washington and Lee, who I believe were the next highest kind of overall seeds. Hand wavy because we didn't know exact seeds last year. And it could be the committee observed that experience or the results of what they did there and weren't big fans of it. And in this scenario, because they knew that they would love to have Whitman host, but are not having them host, make it as soft of a pod as possible by having the second best team in that pod be the lower ranked Stout than the higher ranked Bethel.
Yeah, I think that's all really well explained. I mean, that's exactly, I think, what the thought is here. Admittedly, I think it's hard to see Whitman, do everything that they need to do to get into a place where, top 5 MPI, right, and still not get to host. And again, if you look a little bit further down, there's not really a way for them to host sectionals, right? Host that second weekend. Even if Colorado College were to come out of like it, just you look down, it's going to be going to Scranton, right? So that's at this point, Whitman loses out on the opportunity to host the NCAA tournament. But again, we talked about this. I think you and I, or maybe this was on the one that you did by yourself not too long ago, but they were going to prioritize the top 8, but that didn't necessarily mean that those top 8 were all going to host. You know, like you might think, right? That's not what the top 8 meant. It just meant they were protected from having to play another one of the top 8. So they were able to do that here. And I do think the logic on putting that Stout over like a Bethel might make a lot of sense here. And I know it's not maybe something that's going to be a super popular approach with some maybe, but I think when you look at it and what the committee is trying to do, again, balancing out those priorities, I think they did the best job they could handling the situation. Again, we don't know how many flights they were allowed. It's possible that they wanted to get Whitman a pod and were not able to. So we don't know exactly all that stuff that's going on behind the scenes at the same time. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well here.
And this is jumping ahead topics in our show a little bit, but I think it's relevant here. Is I looked at the top 16 seeds in each across all of the quadrants, and if Chalk wins out, it looks like the top four overall seeds are lined up to host sectionals, which that might have been treated as a higher priority than having all of the top 8 host opening rounds.
Right.
And so I think like maybe you can have a difference of opinion on what order those priorities should go. But if that was indeed the priority, like, hey, I'm sure all teams would like if they happen to be top 4 in a year that their sectional hosting chances are prioritized higher,
Right.
And so it's just a lot of moving pieces that you cannot optimize all of them.
Yep. Yeah, and
So
I was gonna say it's a hard part of being an island team, but I think you understand that too if you're at a place like Whitman. By this point, it's not maybe a great surprise, even if it's disappointing.
So once we knew that Whitman was not hosting, that means that, I mean, we already saw Cal Lutheran, but the question is, where is Colorado College going? And we learned quickly here, they are going into Wisconsin Whitewater. I think another byproduct of Whitman not hosting was you were probably going to get 2 YX schools in a same pod somewhere. And we did here. So Whitewater hosts Principia, and Colorado College plays lacrosse. This is not the greatest seeded pod, but again, it's because Principia, well, no, actually, no. They were a 16 seed, but they are seeded here as a 14 seed. So a pretty soft opening round game for Whitewater. And then the other three teams are only one quadrant seed off. But this is a cool matchup with, I don't think SLIAC teams have played many WIAC teams. And definitely, well, we do have SCAC teams playing WIAC teams at times. But cool for Colorado College to get this matchup here.
Yeah, no, I think so. And again, they had to be creative. We knew Colorado College would be a flight wherever they ended up being sent, and I think it'll be a unique matchup. Them against lacrosse, who again lacrosse stands out as one of those teams, 16-11, and then at the same time they have the most top 25 MPI wins. I believe that's still true of any team in the country. So interesting pod here again at Whitewater. Whitewater won the WIAC tournament this past weekend. So we'll see how that all plays out, but it'll be a cool matchup either way. Getting a Whitewater Colorado College matchup would be interesting. And I also want to note, I know there's this whole thing of conference rematches, and I think the committee does try to avoid that as best as they can. But you see it in Texas all the time. Obviously, you see it here. When you get 5 WIACs into a tournament, there's just not enough places to send these teams unless you're going to start adding flights. And like we just talked about, they're trying to, it seems, minimize flights potentially to set up for the second weekend. So unfortunately, or however you look at it, we do get 2 WIACs in the same pot here.
Yep, and you could. I mean, if you tried to do a swap with the Illinois Wesleyan Center Trine Transylvania pod, even if you could make geography work without adding a flight, it could be that seating has to change,
And then again, the priorities come into play. Do you want to maintain seeding over that conference potential rematch in the second round kind of thing? I think at this point, having seeds is probably more of a priority. At least I would see as more of a priority to get the better matchups than to avoid something that may potentially happen, but isn't guaranteed to happen. Because again, that's talking about a second round deal.
Mm-hmm. Now we move on to at Johns Hopkins. They host St. Joseph of Connecticut, and Carnegie Mellon plays Bridgewater State. This is a pretty well seeded pod as well. Bridgewater State is more of a true 10, but they are seeded here as a 12. Actually, that is right. 4-13, 5-12. But the rest are all either spot on or one spot off. Anytime we have an Ohio school involved, like Carnegie Mellon, you often have really, really interesting matchups because of where they are located. So we've got Carnegie Mellon versus Bridgewater at Johns Hopkins, which is a kind of a cool melting pot of teams.
Yeah, it really is. And then you throw St. Joseph of Connecticut in there as well. So you get a couple coming down from the Northeast, one from Ohio, then obviously Johns Hopkins in that kind of middle Atlantic region. So yeah, that'll be a fun pod for sure. Interested to see what Carnegie Mellon does. They've kind of been on a roll lately, especially closing out UEA play the way they did. So it'll be interesting to see the way that all plays out down there. I think again you mentioned it, pretty well seeded pod too.
And then our last pod at Scranton, they host Mount St. Mary, and Southern Virginia plays Bates. That's a cool 8-9 matchup, as they almost always are. And this is another really well-seeded pod.
Right. And you get a USA South team that has actually put up some really nice results this year in terms of, they beat Christopher Newport, only team to have done that this year, also beat Bridgewater out of Virginia. And they're playing a Bates team that we've talked about it. Put together a huge second half through NESCAC play. Certainly has some momentum at this point, and then playing those at Scranton again, just unique matchups there. So, again, pretty well put together bracket as a whole. Not a ton of things that looked off, especially seeding wise. So I think that's a positive, especially in this first year of MPI and trying to balance all that out. It definitely incorporated and added a few new factors for the committee to consider as they started bracketing things.
Yep. So now we're going to look at where are the most difficult areas of this bracket. We're going to look first on the pod level. I don't think average NPI is actually that great of a metric to look at here. Just the nature of NPI kind of forces everyone to have really close numbers that don't indicate actual gaps between the teams as well. And so I think the order of NPI is really good, but the gaps are all really small when there might be gaps between teams that are larger. But let's look at efficiency margin. So this is really just point differential over 100 possessions. So your toughest pod is actually that Scranton, Southern Virginia, Bates, Mount St. Mary. So a lot of tough teams in that pod. The NYU pod is always going to be up here just because NYU is a crazy outlier, and they can drag that average efficiency up all by themselves. Oshkosh, that pod comes in third most difficult on average efficiency margin. The Christopher Newport Catholic pod fourth, Ohio Wesleyan fifth, and Gustavus Adolphus pod sixth. You can see the average is 34.3. That's points per 100 possessions. Games are usually around 65 to 70 possessions. And then your easiest would be the Whitewater pod at about a margin of 20 average margin. Then the East Texas Baptist pod, Macon pod. Surprisingly to me, the Illinois Wesleyan pod, and then the Stout pod. So anything jump out to you, Riley?
I mean, I was gonna say I'm kind of surprised the Illinois Wesleyan pod is where it is, but I think if you think about it, it makes a little bit more sense. Center, Transylvania, again, both of those teams again have kind of turned it on the second half of this year. But if you look at just their seasons as a whole, there is kind of a reason for that to make sense. The Whitewater pod, I think it's interesting because on the surface you look and it doesn't. Colorado College has been really, really solid this year. Lacrosse obviously stands out with the teams that they've beaten. But again, I think, when you start to break it down and look at the numbers, there is reason to think, again, you add, like you said, True 16 there with Principia out of SLIAC. So whenever you start to incorporate some of those dynamics, I think it tends to make a little bit more sense.
It'll be interesting to see what all of these look like after the initial round of games for the round of 32.
Right.
And I think they would look extremely even. So then moving on to the quadrants, we can see already it gets really narrow. And so that top right quadrant with NYU is first, 26.9 average efficiency over 100 possessions among those 16 teams. But you can see next is 26.2, then 25.8, and then 25.3. And so the difference between the four quadrants is 1.6 points per 100 possessions.
Yeah, not much.
Very, very, very even quadrants. And then when you look at the side, 0.7 point difference between the two sides as a whole. Another thing I wanted to look at is I do track age and height of the teams. And so this class, if you think of a freshman as a 1, a senior as a 4, and a grad as a 5, I weight it by points scored. And so the oldest team in the tournament is UMass Dartmouth. You can see their scoring comes from between a senior and a grad on average from their team as a whole. St. Joseph, Connecticut is also a very experienced team. Wartburg, Gustavus, Messiah, Whitman, and Ohio Wesleyan, and Stout and Cobleskill are all going to be very, very experienced senior and grad-led teams. Let's freeze those panes. Down to the youngest team is Cortland, who are barely above a sophomore as far as their scoring weighted class year, along with Merchant Marine, Trinity, Calvin, Bates, Center, Wisconsin Lutheran. No real insinuations here. I think it's just interesting to see the difference in class years between the teams that make the tournament.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think it does give you an idea, though, of some teams that you might be looking for to be back here again next year, because a team like Cortland, as young as they are, doing what they've done this year, winning the SUNYAC, it's a good sign for the future of that program. And then obviously some of the more experienced teams, I think you can certainly maybe develop some. I know sometimes it's overplayed, and overstated, but just the experience that team has, with multiple seniors, multiple grad students playing in these types of higher pressure NCAA tournament situations, might be a little bit more, in position to handle that. A team like Wartburg, right, that went to the Final Four last year, has made multiple, of these tournament runs. Those players kind of have been in these spots before. So, but yeah, really interesting just to look at it from a breakdown perspective.
And I also broke it down as the largest differences in age between first round matchups. And so the largest is Mass Dartmouth and Trinity, Connecticut. They're about 2 classes apart. And then Gustavus and Wisconsin Lutheran are 1.31 apart, and Wartburg and Stevens Point are 1.26 class years apart. And then Montclair State and Christopher Newport are basically the same. Piedmont and Randolph-Macon are basically the same. Trine, Pennsylvania are basically the same. I also keep track of minutes weighted height. Don't ask me why I picked to weight class by scoring and height by minutes, but we can also see the tallest teams in the tournament. NYU is the tallest team at 70.6 inches, followed by Whitewater, Amherst, La Crosse, Calvin, and ETBU. And then your shortest team is St. Joseph of Connecticut. But you can see, like, there's not much difference between teams from even the tallest and the shortest in the tournament. But that's one thing that is always interesting about brand new teams facing each other is everyone has a different style. And if you have very different styles, it's who can implement and dictate the style that they want to see in the game that best benefits the personnel that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a fun part of this whole thing is, it's the matchups. It's how do teams and the different styles, specifically when you do get those interesting regions, playing each other, as we talked about with a few of these, because, some of these teams coming out of the Northeast might have a different style than a team coming out of, maybe a Middle Atlantic or an Ohio or some of these things. So interesting to see the way that all plays out as well.
So we're going to now look at hosting scenarios for sectionals. So up here, I'm not going to go terribly in depth, but we're looking at the top seeds. So it's going to be Bowdoin and Smith and East Texas Baptist and Gustavus Adolphus. So Bowdoin is the top seed in this quadrant. Whoever comes out of Gustavus and East Texas Baptist are going to have to fly to sectionals. And I believe just about everyone in the top 8 teams here can get to Bowdoin. And so if Bowdoin does make sectionals, I don't really see any other scenario that they don't host sectionals.
Right. Yeah, they're set up as the top overall seed to be in that spot.
And that would make sense, right? East Texas Baptist and that pod and Gustavus's pod are kind of your wild cards if you're the committee, because wherever you put them, you don't have to plan through, like, what if the second best team in this pod gets through the third best team? Like, could that flip geography? And they chose to use those wild cards here in the Bowdoin quadrant with their number 1 overall seed. Makes a lot of sense. Down here in the bottom left, we've got Baldwin Wallace is your top seed. Other top seeds are Ohio Wesleyan, Oshkosh, and Illinois Wesleyan. I believe Illinois Wesleyan can get to Baldwin Wallace just fine. So even though most of the teams from the Oshkosh pod, well, actually Oshkosh can't and Bethel can't, but I bet you DePauw and Calvin can get to Baldwin Wallace. There's not a lot of scenarios here where Baldwin Wallace is not hosting sectionals, because I think everyone from the Ohio Wesleyan pod can get to Baldwin Wallace. And I think everyone from the Illinois Wesleyan pod can get to Baldwin Wallace. So here,
Right.
even if we see not the best team in a pod get through to the Sweet 16, this really looks like it is Baldwin Wallace's sectional if they can get that far. Over in the top right, this is an interesting one, and we do have a question here. So NYU's a top seed in this quadrant. We also have Catholic, Randolph-Macon, and Gettysburg. So everyone there can get to NYU. So in the scenario that the NYU men do not make sectionals, NYU women are set up to be hosting that. And if the NYU men do get through to sectionals, Gettysburg looks like they will be hosting, indeed will be hosting sectionals. There might be some bizarre scenario in here, but I think they all feel pretty reasonably close geographically. And so I don't know if there's some weird Tufts, Macon, Newport scenario where a host goes somewhere else, but really this is going to be at NYU. The committee did not bracket this assuming that the NYU men would host and take away that possibility. So the NYU men are set up to host if they have that ability. But if they don't, Gettysburg can host and everybody can get to Gettysburg. So that does seem like a pretty simple quadrant as well. And then down here, this is an interesting one. Whitman is your top seed in that pod. Wisconsin, Whitewater, Johns Hopkins, and Scranton. Now, the interesting team here to me is Carnegie Mellon, because Carnegie Mellon, I do believe, can get to Whitewater. We're going to do it live. Carnegie Mellon, nope, they cannot get to Whitewater, 565. So that idea is out. I was wondering if there was a way that Scranton wouldn't host if, say, Stout, Whitewater, and Carnegie Mellon came through, where everyone could get to Whitewater, except Scranton. But that does not look like the case. So it does look like this is also lined up to go to Scranton, as whoever comes out of the Whitman pod and the Whitewater pod are going to be flying. And so at that point, it's going to be the same number of flights, regardless of where you host it, and give it to the top team, Scranton.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, Scranton's now, in a good spot there because, like you said, it'll be 2 flights either way.
So you can see there were ways that you could set this up where Scranton or Baldwin Wallace or NYU is not set up to be hosting sectionals. And it does look like they saved that flight opening round by not hosting at Whitman to make that reality the case here in the sectionals for pretty much all of the secondary and tertiary scenarios of who gets through the Sweet 16. That's hosting scenarios. So I wrote code to simulate the NCAA tournament and take this with a large grain of salt, or many grains of salt, because I did not add logic to figure out home court advantage starting at the sectional round. So starting at the sectional round, every game was assumed to be a neutral court result. But let me find my... So over 1,000 simulations, the team that averaged the most wins was NYU, averaging 5.9 wins out of a possible 6 across all of the 1,000 simulations. Scranton 3.7, Bowdoin 3.3, Smith. I thought that this was interesting. Smith was 4th highest, being in the same quadrant as Bowdoin. Ohio Wesleyan, Gustavus Adolphus, and Gettysburg. And then this percentage here is not the percentage of winning the championship. It is the percentage of appearing in the championship game. You can see that Scranton's percentage is really low, not because they're a bad team, but because in a lot of simulations, they face NYU in the semifinals. And teams like Bowdoin and Smith do not face NYU in the semifinals, national semifinals. Right. Elite 8 percentage, nothing terribly interesting or out of that I wouldn't expect there. Sweet 16 percentage. Also, DePauw actually ends up kind of high in Sweet 16 percentage. Wouldn't have expected to see. Well, DePauw over Trine is probably because Trine would have to beat Illinois Wesleyan in the second round, and that is a tough ask. But these are just simulations. I was hoping to find something interesting that indicated an easier or a harder path for some teams, but other than the obvious, we're going to face NYU earlier than other teams might, there wasn't anything that very clearly jumped out at me in this.
Yeah.
I think, is there anything else that we want to cover?
I mean, I was just kind of looking through it. I don't think we got any more questions in. I feel like we covered just about everything in terms of going through the bracket and kind of even looking ahead to potential second weekend scenarios. Not really sure if there's anything else to touch on. I
Let's
think the bracket was seated pretty well.
I agree. Let's just hit 2 questions. So Pete was asking, how often does a top 4 team not get through the Sweet 16? I have no idea. I don't have historical data on that. But I feel like from growing up doing brackets for the Division 1 tournament, it was never 4 1s, right? So it was always kind of
Right.
like 2 1s, a 2 or a 3, and then a team not from the top 3 is usually who you're trying to pick from your bracket. And so it might be 25% of the time a top 4 team doesn't get through, or 30% of the time. But that is just a complete guess. And then we had a question completely unrelated to the NCAA tournament, but we can talk about this real quick. So let's just look right now. The difference between Massey and NPI. Nope, we don't want to delete it. We want to hide it. So your absolute difference teams, for example, would be Merchant Marine, Farmingdale, Hunter, Loras, and some in opposite directions. So, I mean, Merchant Marine might be the best one to talk about. Why would they be rated so much lower in Massey than an NPI? Well, I think the reason is that NPI is, it is still largely a can you win a lot of games formula. Because if you beat, I don't know what the exact break-even point is, but if you beat team 200, that's going to be, I'm pretty sure, better than any single loss is worth to you. And Merchant Marine went out there and beat almost everyone on their schedule. It wasn't a very strong schedule, and I think they had a good amount of close games. And so that's what Massey is keying into. They're like, hey, we're seeing their opponents being, in that 150 to 250 range, and they are not dominating them. And I would bet you if we were able to wave a magic wand and this exact same Merchant Marine team goes through this exact same season again and again and again, 2 losses might be close to the lowest number of losses that they have in any of those simulations. And I think that's what Massey is trying to say. Like, hey, we think their true team might be closer to 195 than 49. And on the flip side would be Loras. That's a team that played a really, really strong schedule, especially in non-conference, and lost most of those games. And so once you lose a game, even if it's to a good team, NPI just doesn't give you tons and tons of credit for it. And that's hard to come back from. I'm pretty sure they had at least double-digit losses, if not closer to 15. But Massey is like, hey, you lost to these teams, but kind of close, and they were good opponents. And so it could be that if Loras in non-conference played teams 25 spots worse than the ones that they did, they would have won 5 more games. And so that's what a system like Massey can do, is it can kind of not prognosticate, but kind of guess what is the true ability level of this team, taking into account all of margin of victory. And so that would probably be the main reason is NPI doesn't care if you beat a team by 1 or beat them by 40. And they also don't care if you lost by 1 or lost by 40. And Massey is going to assign largely different values for that. And efficiency will do similar. I realized I was actually looking at that efficiency column, but 195 to 33, 94 to 232. Yeah. And it's interesting to see, I think, less difference between efficiency and NPI than Massey and NPI. So another thing Massey does is it incorporates every game that a team plays, even against non-Division III teams. And that is just information, because you can find a ranking of every single collegiate women's basketball team, 1 to like 1,200, or actually it's probably more than 1,200, 2,000 in Massey. And so even Whitman's loss to, I don't even remember who it was that they lost to early in the season.
I think it was Lewis and Clark State.
Lewis and Clark State. That becomes data in Massey system that is not data to NPI, and I believe is not data to D3 Datacast's efficiency margin as well. But that's an interesting question. And I think the more that you understand the differences between the systems, you can see like, oh, it's important what we're trying to measure and what sort of outcome do we want. I think right now NPI is still very much a most deserving teams get into the NCAA tournament, because you have to win games, either win just a ton of games like Merchant Marine did, or beat a lot of good teams like Tufts and La Crosse did. Whereas Massey will look at Massey is more of a best team ranking, where it can say like, oh, we see you played the best 5 teams and you lost by an average of 4 points. We think you're really good, even though you're 0-5 against them. And NPI is like, nah, that's nice, but we want you to win some games too. And I think you could have endless arguments over whether selection for the NCAA tournament should be better as the best team or the most deserving, but I think I kind of like it as most deserving, because at the end of the day, sports are a binary result, right? You get a win and you get a loss. You don't get a partial win or a partial loss, regardless of how close it was.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think the thing is too, you can go through Massey and you look and you see a lot of those like teams like out of the WIAC, right? Like La Crosse has been very, very high all year in Massey. But it's because they're grading out, like they're rewarding you for playing those really top level teams where, as you said, MPI isn't, like not in the same way, right? And because a loss to the number 1 team in the country will more than likely, if you can keep it close, if you keep it respectable, it will more than likely help you in Massey. It will not do that at MPI. If you look at teams over the course of this season and kind of their fluctuation within Massey, I think you tend to see some of those trends, especially as conference play goes on. Those WIAC teams, those UAA teams play that really, really tough competition week in, week out. It benefits them a lot in Massey.
Yep. And then I do keep some per game data, and you can see like, I hate to single out Leon, or Case Western. Like Case Western lost to NYU by 76. So that's not going to help them in a ranking like Massey, even though NYU is a strong team. But I'm sure we can find someone here that lost narrowly. Mount Union lost by 1 to Baldwin Wallace.
Yep.
They're going to get way more credit for a result like that in a system like Massey or efficiency margin than they will in a system like NPI. Yep. And just the more of those types of results you have is where you're going to see divergence between the two systems.
Yep.
But I think that's it for us. Thanks for joining, everybody. We're available on social media. We'll be following the entire tournament and following along with the rest of you.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. A lot of great games ahead.
See you all later.